I would say you're ready to go.
Sure. We think so, Aim? Okay.
Yep.
All right, we'll roll. Hello, I'm Kate Gardner, Executive Director of Alpha Sigma Nu, and I'm happy to welcome you to the first of Alpha Sigma Nu's Lenten series, which will be prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. This evening, I'm very happy to introduce Father James Martin of the Society of Jesus, as he will talk about prayer for the first of our Lenten topics. On March 23rd, Eric Clayton of the Jesuit Conference of Canada in the United States and Brenna Davis of the Ignatian Solidarity Network will speak on fasting towards freedom. And then on April 5th, Carrie Weber, Executive Director of America Magazine, will help us explore the Lenten theme of almsgiving and how to give alms in 2022. As many of you know, Father Martin is editor-at-large of America Media and the best-selling author of Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything and Jesus a Pilgrimage, as well as his new book, Learning to Pray. In recent years, Father Martin has been a prolific voice calling for more dialogue between the LGBT community and the Catholic Church. Surely we know Father Martin may speak on those issues, but I am sure I speak for many of us when I say we look to you and are grateful for your spiritual guidance and wisdom on so many issues that pull on our hearts and souls, and that they are the things we pray for. Just a few recent examples include your article on Ash Wednesday, What We Can Do This Lent to Return to the Lord. You're praying for peace in the Ukraine, even when it feels useless. 5 signs you're hearing God's voice and not your ego in prayer. 5 spiritual tips to help you avoid pandemic despair. Sad, tired, and angry, a prayer in the face of gun violence. Civility in public and church discourse. The Holy Spirit is moving us to act against racism. Were Jesus, Mary, and Joseph refugees? Yes. All of these things we know we pray for. Father Martin, we thank you for helping us deepen our prayer life this Lent, and we're so glad you're with us. And you're a member, Weston, I forget what year.
98, 99. Yeah, thanks so much, Kate. Good to be with both of you and all of you, all 58 of you, fellow Alpha Sigma Nu members. I am a proud Alpha Sigma Nu member myself, and it's a real wonderful organization to be a part of, and you guys do such great work. We're going to talk about prayer tonight, as Kate was saying, and then we're going to have a discussion afterwards. And do you want to introduce yourself first, Amy?
I'm Amy O'Neill. I'm the Director of Development and Alumni Relations at Alpha Sigma Nu. And I wanted to let you all know, if you have a question, just go ahead and put it in the Q&A or chat feature, and we'll try and get to as many as we can at the end of Father Martin's talk. So thank you.
Great. So why don't we begin with a prayer, since it's prayer, fasting, and almsgiving time. Let's begin with a prayer. Let's just take a moment and remember, probably at the end of a busy day or maybe a stressful day for all of us, that God is with us, God is giving us peace, and God is offering us the promise of an encounter with God. Loving God, we thank you for bringing us together. We thank you for the gift of community, for Alpha Sigma Nu, for the church in our lives. As we think about ways to draw closer to you in prayer, give us a spirit of openness and trust. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So I want to talk a little bit about prayer tonight. It's going to be drawn from my book. This is the last time I do an ad, Learning to Pray, a guide for everyone. And I wanted to start off by talking about that subtitle and the first sentence of my book, which is everyone can pray. Now I know that all Jesuit grads, Jesuit alumni, Jesuit colleges and universities, maybe some people who are still in college and university, or maybe even Jesuit high school alumni, you've heard a lot about prayer. But I would bet that if you're like most Catholics, you think, yeah, I can't pray, or I'm not really good at it, or everyone else prays better than me, or I'm missing the boat, or I don't know what's supposed to happen. And I'm here to tell you that everyone can pray. And if I can pray, you can pray. And why do we say that? Well, the first thing is that everyone has a desire for prayer. So all of you here, 50 plus people here, are here not just because you're Alpha Sigma Nu members, but because you're interested in learning about prayer. Where does that desire come from? That desire comes from God, right? The desire for God comes from God. So that's one way that God has of calling us, right, closer to God. I saw this summed up in a retreat house a few years ago in New Jersey. And it said, that which you seek is seeking you. So that the very desire that you have for prayer, for more spiritual life, for more contemplative life, or encounter with God, maybe you were on a retreat once in your college years or in your high school years, and you want that desire is God's way of calling you. How else would God awaken in you a desire, right, for prayer? So the first thing in the life of prayer is to recognize that desire you have, you can't mistake it because you're on this call, right? You have a desire for prayer. That's God's call to you. So to take that seriously and to know that you are responding to a call, it's not just you being curious, right? Or you feeling a sense of obligation. It's God's call for you. But then that brings up the question of, what prayer is, right? When we talk about prayer, what is it? And I'm going to look at a few definitions that I think will help us in our discussion. The first definition is prayer is a raising of the mind and heart to God and an asking of good things. That's from St. John Damascene, who was a 4th century Syrian monk. And that's a good start, right? That's the definition that begins the Catechism's discussion of prayer, right? Catechism of the Catholic Church. And it makes sense. Prayer is a raising of the mind and heart. It's not just our mind, it's our heart too. And an asking of good things. I can guarantee that every one of the 65 now people have asked for something in prayer. You've all asked for the pandemic to end. You've all asked for vaccines, which we've gotten. You've all asked for healing for people. I mean, all of us have asked for things. So that's part of prayer. The second definition is from Saint Therese of Lisieux, the Carmelite nun, often called the Little Flower. And she said, prayer is a surge of the heart. Okay, that makes sense. It's almost something we can't not do, right? It's like we surge out. We want to be with God. God, we have this love for God. We want to be in relationship with God. And those two definitions are great, but then it's sort of one-sided. It makes you think, well, while we're raising our mind and our heart to God and are surging out, what's God doing, right? Like it's a little bit of a one-way street. That's where St. Teresa of Avila's definition comes in, which is that prayer is a mutual sharing between friends, a kind of conversation. That gets a little bit more into the mutual aspect of it. Now, what does it mean to listen? I mean, it's not that we hear voices or see visions. We'll talk about that later. But essentially, it's listening to God in your daily life, like through the examination of conscience, like listening that way. And listening in your prayer, like actual the times that you're going to pray. We're going to talk about that later on. So a conversation, right? Conversation that goes on through our life, but especially during our time of prayer. The next definition I find really helpful is from some of you probably know this name. You may have even known him if you're of a certain age, as they say, Walter Burkhardt. Prayer is a long, loving look at the real. I'm sure you've all heard that. It's a great definition. It's long because it's not rushed, right? Like any good relationship. It's loving because it's done in the context of love. It's a look. It's a kind of contemplative look. And as Burkhardt points out, it's often about the real, about stuff in our lives, right? Especially like the examination of conscience. But the definition that has really, really changed my life was from, I'm sure many of you knew him or read his stuff, Father Bill Barry, who died about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And his definition was that prayer is a personal relationship with God. Now, what does that mean? This is developed in many of Bill's books, and especially God and You, which is a great book. And he said that prayer can be compared to a relationship you have with a friend. Now, what does that mean? Well, what does it mean to be in a good relationship with someone or good friendship? Anything you can say about a good friendship, you can say by analogy. It's not the perfect analogy about your relationship with God. So what makes for a good friendship? Well, first, time. Let's say I said to you, well, this is my best friend, so-and-so. How much time do you spend with him? None, right? Or my mother or my brother or my father is or my children are the most important part of my life. I really spend a lot of time with them one-on-one? No. I mean, I see people laughing, but it's true because, we would never say that. But in terms of our relationship with God, sometimes we say that. We say, oh, God's the most important thing in my life. Do you spend much one-on-one time with God? No, too busy. So a good relationship requires time. What else does it require? Well, it requires listening. Let's say Kate and I went out to dinner we haven't seen each other in the flesh for a long time, and all I did was talk. Now you might say, well, that's just like Jesuits, but that's a weird relationship. That's all I did was talk. But that's how it is with God sometimes. We sit down and we talk and talk and talk and talk. So part of it's listening too. Again, listening in your daily life, listening in your prayer. What other things make for a good friendship? Honesty. What happens, this is one of Barry's great insights. What happens when you say only the things that you think that you should say to someone in a relationship? It gets kind of cold, doesn't it? Right? Very formal, kind of distant. Sometimes the relationship ends. So oftentimes when people feel distant, it's because they're blocked because they're not being honest. You know, even stuff that you would not think is a hard thing to talk about, like I'm disappointed in you, God, or I'm angry, or I feel this. People feel that it's not appropriate to talk about it, but God wants our honesty. I was thinking of the story of Martha and Mary. Remember Luke's gospel? Where Martha, by the way, since this is International Women's Day, a good thing to remember, I'm doing a book on Lazarus. This is an aside. And this might blow you away, but Martha and Mary are in the house in Bethany, right, when Jesus comes. And one of the quotes that I'm going to say is that she says to Jesus, tell her to help me, about Mary, who's supposedly being lazy, right? And the point of me bringing this up is that, you know, she's honest with Jesus the way we should be honest with God. By the way, I'm sure you're all thinking about that as the meal at the house. It's not a meal. There's no mention of a meal in there. Martha is doing, isn't that amazing? Martha is doing diakonia. She's described as doing service, work, diakonia. I know. And I said, wait, of course there's a meal in there. There's not. And one of the reasons people think that was sort of said, oh, it's a meal, is that the kind of connection between Martha and diakonia was too much for the early church. Is that interesting? But Martha in this story is very honest with Jesus, same way we're supposed to be honest with God. So all the things that make for a good friendship make for a good relationship with God. And it's a good way, Bill Barry's model is a good way of kind of diagnosing what might be wrong with your relationship, you know, with God. So the definition I like that I use with people is prayer is a conscious conversation with God. It happens within the context of a personal relationship, but it's a conscious conversation. All right, so I think most of you know the kind of techniques in prayer. And again, if you want to read more about it, it's in my book. So most of you probably know the examination of conscience. You've probably heard that a million times. Most of you probably know Ignatian contemplation, where you're imagining yourself in a scene. Most of you probably know Lectio Divina, where you're going through a scripture passage and asking questions. Most of you probably know centering prayer, journaling, nature prayer, rote prayer like the rosary. But so what I thought I'd talk about tonight is something that I think is much more misunderstood. And all those things are easy in a sense to learn. You know, you can read about them, you can read the steps. And I'd like to talk about what happens in prayer, because I think no topic is more misunderstood than this. And it is spoken about in some spiritual books with the sense of just kind of vagueness. And when I entered the Jesuits, people would say to me, oh, I felt God invite me to do this. I was like, what are you talking about? Or then God said this to me, or God raised. I was like, what are you talking about? And I'd close my eyes and I'd be like, what am I supposed to hear voices or visions, or is it not working? And truly, and I'm sure most of everybody on this call, now 70 people, you've had that experience. You've sat down and you close your eyes and you're like, you know I should pray and I want to pray. So what I'd like to do is talk about the most common things that come up in prayer. And let's take a gospel passage. Let's take today's gospel, which is Jesus teaching the disciples the Our Father. And then at the end, you know, talking about asking for forgiveness, right? And telling people to forgive, right? So it's a very simple gospel reading, great reading for Lent, and a good one to start our discussion. So let's assume that you, with your best intentions in mind, sit down and you say, I'm going to pray about this gospel reading. Now, what I'm about to say about the results or the fruits of prayer doesn't have to focus just on the gospel reading. In other words, it could come up when you're praying about anything. Imagining yourself talking about Jesus, sort of putting yourself in the presence of God, you know, reading a spiritual book and just kind of being quiet. So what kinds of things can come up? What can you expect? Well, the first thing is, and I should have put in this book this way, the first thing is nothing. Because sometimes it doesn't feel like there's a whole lot going on. Now, I believe that any time spent in the presence of God is transformative. There's something going on deep within you, but you may not be able to be aware of it. But sometimes things may seem dry. We have to admit that. Sometimes it's just dry. That's okay. Not every time you go out with your friend, it's going to be like bells and whistles. I often say to people, do you know when you go see a friend, you're like, oh, I can't wait to see so-and-so, and you go out to dinner, or what if we're lucky in COVID, or you go for a walk, or even you call them, and afterwards you're like, didn't feel like a whole lot was going on, or I don't know, my expectations were too high. That's like God. I mean, not every single prayer experience is going to be rich and feel wonderful, although I think something's going on. Just like in a relationship, just being in touch with that person is something important. All right, so what can come up though? Well, the first thing is an insight. So let's say you're praying about the Our Father and you realize, well, you know, I never noticed that, boy, we're really asking for a lot of stuff. It's not just about praise. It's give us this day our daily bread, deliver us, you know, forgive us. We're asking for stuff. And you just have this insight like, wow, I guess I never thought of it being okay, like Jesus actually telling us to ask for stuff. I always thought that was kind of selfish. And so what's going on? It's an insight. And I think what we have to take seriously is the fact that, you know, God is raising this up in our prayer. It's not just a coincidence. It's one way God has of speaking to us, as it were. So insights are very common in prayer, probably the most common thing. And I think in Jesuit circles, we've probably all been on retreats. Jesuits and their colleagues tend to privilege emotional responses. Our joke in the novitiate was always, you know, how was your retreat? It was good. Did you cry? If you didn't cry, it doesn't count. Doesn't count. So an insight can be kind of is a fruit of the prayer. Okay, so pay attention when these things come up. My spiritual director, David Donovan, who I think many of you know, always would say, pay attention. It's a great, you know, it's not just something that happens to occur to you, it's God raising it up. But probably the second most common thing is emotions. An emotion can come up. Give us this day our daily bread. Let's just say, and it comes out of nowhere, and you just have this feeling of kind of joy. You just have this feeling of joy, and I just feel so happy that you know, that Jesus is inviting me to pray for something I need. Joy. Let's say you're praying about it's further on in Lent, and you're praying about the Passion, and you feel a sense of sorrow. You feel, boy, I feel like, you know, with Ukraine, that they're being crucified right now. You just have this sorrow over, and suddenly Ukraine comes up. You're praying about the Passion, but that comes up really vividly. And someone you saw on a street, or I saw a video of, this is true, I saw a video of a little boy dragging a suitcase. Have you seen that one? Crying. Oh my gosh. Like crossing the border. And that comes up, and you feel sad. Trust that God is raising this up for a reason. You know, God is sort of unearthing or revealing this sadness to you, this kind of deep sadness from the story of the Passion, or joy from the story of the Our Father. And I think one of the invitations is to say, what's going on in me, right? What does this sadness mean? Is it a way that God has of moving me to kind of identify with these refugees, right? Is God kind of how else would God move us? I mean, how else is God going to stir this up? Even Jesus's heart was moved with pity when he saw crowds probably very much like the ones that are leaving Ukraine, right? Like sheep without a shepherd, right? So emotions are very important in prayer. Really pay attention to those. Another thing that can come up is a memory. Oftentimes, especially on retreats, this happens a lot, but in our daily life, you might be praying with the Our Father, and somehow you have this memory of, oh my gosh, I remember learning this. I remember learning this in school. I remember learning this in, if you went to Catholic elementary school, I didn't. We went to CCD. Now we're not allowed to say that. We have to say religious education. I've been corrected many times. And you just have this memory of this person who taught you this. Where's that coming from? It's, you know, God might be raising this up in you to show you something. You know, one good thing to ask is, what occurs to me when these things come up? Maybe it's just simply to remind you of how much faith formation you've had, or someone who was nice to you, or maybe it's daily bread. Maybe you think about your grandmother making, or your grandfather for that matter, making bread, right? Now, you have this image of your grandfather making, he used to love to make sourdough bread, and you just, where's that coming from? Well, sometimes God just raises these things up in us to console us. You can spend the whole 15 minutes or half an hour thinking about your grandfather. So memories can come up in prayer. So emotions, insights, memories, a desire is very, I mean, we all know in Ignatian spirituality, desire is very important. And what I mean by desire is you are, I'll tell you one of my favorite examples that happened to a woman I was directing, I think on a retreat. And she said to me that she was praying with the call of the first disciples, right? So in the synoptics, Jesus goes from Nazareth to Capernaum and calls them at the Sea of Galilee, Peter and Andrew and James and John. And she imagined that in an Ignatian scene, right? And she wanted to, she was away. She was like apart from the group in her imagination. And she had this desire. She wanted to join them. She said, seems like they're having fun. She wanted to be with the disciples. And so and I said, well, you know, how else would Jesus call you other than by raising up within you the desire to follow him, right? So desire to be a holier person, a desire in your prayer, which is very common, to live a more prayerful life. Boy, this is really nice. Why am I so crazy? I was reading an article today in the Times about the New York Times about loneliness and how people who choose solitude, you know, can have these wonderful experiences. Like, I like this, you know, and why haven't I lived like this more before? A quieter, sort of more disconnected from, you know, your devices, right? So what am I trying to say in a very inarticulate way? You might, in your prayer, have a desire for more prayer, right? You like, this is really nice, but so there's a desire like that come up. A desire to be like a holy person you think of, right? Maybe you heard a homily by, I don't know, by Greg Boyle or by Helen Prejean or Joyce Rupp or any of your favorite, or Pope Francis about the Our Father, and it comes to you and you're like, oh my gosh, they're so admirable. You know, Sister Helen and Joyce Rupp and whoever you like, whoever's your, you know, kind of Catholic or Christian hero, right? Or a secular hero. You're like, why does that come up? Well, you have this desire to be like them. That's a really holy desire. So desires can come up in prayer. Again, I want to be clear, not every time you sit down will these things come up. But I do want to bring them up because there's such a misunderstanding of what's supposed to happen when I close my eyes. So insights, emotions, memories, desires, feelings, very important. Feelings like calm. I can't think of a feeling that is more desirable in the pandemic and in this crazy time than calm. In fact, for me, that the most helpful advice has been that that people seem to like is that hope is coming from God and despair never is. Right? Calm is coming from God. That's St. Ignatius says that's the way that the good spirit works, by giving us a sense of calm, of peace, of uplift, of encouragement. That is for people going in the right path. That's all of us. I mean, there aren't any murderers here, like, you know, signing on to a talk about prayer. So for people trying to do the right thing and going in the right way, God uplifts us and calms us. And the bad spirit, like makes us anxious and panicky. But even when you're and that's in daily life. But even when you're praying, you feel of calm. I'm sure most of you have had that experience, just this feeling of calm. That's coming from God. Trust that this is one way that God has of speaking to you. And then finally is words and phrases. Now, this doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And I don't mean hearing voices. I want to get that up. I have met 3 people in my life that I've been a Jesuit 30 years. 3, to say as many as 3 or only 3. It's funny, when we were in, I used to travel to Lourdes a lot, you know, the French shrine in southern France. And they would say, how many miracles have been documented since 1858? And someone said, this is in this group of the Order of Malta, and someone said, only 68. And another one said, right after, as many as 68, which I thought was just wonderful. So I've only heard of people literally hearing voices 3 times in my life, you know, and they're very short. So don't worry about it. I've never heard a voice. I'd like to once in a while. But mostly what I mean is sort of intuiting words or phrases that come up. It's kind of like remembering the line from a poem or a song or something. That's what I mean by just comes up, right? But sometimes it can happen, and it's I think one way that God has of speaking to us. I'll tell you a story about a Jesuit I know. I won't say who it is because you probably all know him. And he was finishing up his doctorate in Paris, and he didn't know what he wanted to do. His provincial asked him to think about where he wanted to go, meaning, and he thought it meant like he was going to ask God, like, BC or Canisius or Georgetown, or I don't want to name all the schools, but I could. So where should I go? What should I teach? Should it be a college, a high school, blah, blah, blah. So he's in Paris, and he decides he's going to go to Chartres, the cathedral at Chartres, and he's going to kind of make a pilgrimage. Now, there's a little bit of manipulation involved, like I'm going to force God to give me an answer, but it's a nice thing. It's a pilgrimage. It's kind of like an intentional thing. And so he goes to Chartres, he sits down, and he's expecting kind of, something specific, like, have an image of, what is it, Gasson Hall at BC or Healy Hall at Georgetown or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, oh. And he said within about 5 minutes, the words, "feed my sheep," came into his consciousness, which was really, and, he didn't hear them, but it was clear that these are the words that came into his mind. And he realized he had his answer. Now, one of the questions that people ask is, well, how do I know? How do I know that's not just me, right? And in my book, Learning to Pray, I talk a little bit about little guidelines. Now, one of the things I want to say to you all, and that's basically the kinds of things that can happen in prayer. There are also mystical experiences, but they're a little rarer. But those kinds of things can happen when you sit down to pray. So anytime you feel those emotions, memories, insights, desires, words and phrases, feelings, trust that this might be God communicating with you. And I would say this, before I talk about how to discern whether it is or is not, trust yourself. You can usually tell. I mean, if the Jesuit hears "feed my sheep," it's probably pretty clear that it's from God or something's consoling you. So how do we know? Well, the first guideline is that the good spirit or the evil spirit? Is it moving to do something really manifestly bad? Like, I often use the example of someone you're angry with and you want to reconcile, and the image, oh, I want to punch that person in the face. Probably not coming from God, right? But that's an easy one. Does it lead to an increase in love and charity and faith, right? Does the thing that I've experienced, does it seem to lead me to? That's a reasonable thing. Does it fit with my life, right? Does it fit with, like, yeah, feed my sheep seems to fit, right? If I hear like join the circus, and like, no, so the circus comes into my mind, I was like, it might just be a distraction. Does it fit with what I know about God? Would God want this Jesuit to feed his sheep? Yeah, right. Now, is it a distraction? That's a harder thing. What do we do with that? Well, does that sound like a distraction? No, it sounds like something that makes sense. And what if a hamburger came up into my friend's mind? It could happen, you're whatever. Does that mean you're supposed to work at McDonald's? Or you're supposed to drop your prayer and run off to No, it may be a distraction. So I talk about in the book guidelines to help us sort of discern what's coming from God and what might be coming from me. But here's what I want to say. Most people, and all of you, Alpha Sigma Nu, for Pete's sake, Alpha Sigma Nu people from Jesuit colleges and high schools, and universities, you're like probably the most educated alumni we have. Trust yourself. You really should trust yourself in this discernment. You don't have to have a PhD in spirituality to know that when you're praying about the pandemic and you feel this feeling of calm, that's coming from God. So kind of trust yourself. Now that's what, and to go back to Bill Barry's definition, that's what I mean about listening. Listening in prayer. How is God speaking to me? And listening in your daily life. So you probably know the examination of conscience, which is basically a review of the day, right? You sort of see where God was. That's listening too. Where has God been active? And finally, I want to talk a little bit, because it's always on people's minds, about what to do about distractions. Probably the two biggest questions I get are like, what's supposed to happen? And what do I do when I'm distracted? So very briefly, and then we can go to the Q&A. Thomas Merton said, which I love, if you've never been distracted, you've never prayed. It's true. Everybody gets distracted. I get distracted. Ignatius got distracted. He talked about someone whistling in his journals, which I love. Maybe the only people that didn't get distracted is Jesus, but he's praying, and people are like, whoa, we want to make you king, so he probably got distracted too. He's human in addition to divine. Anyway, everybody gets distracted. What do you do with them? Well, the first thing is to distinguish between important distractions and unimportant distractions. I had a Jesuit scholastic come to me. It's a good thing he doesn't know I say this because it's not breaking confidence, but I use this all the time. And he said to me, there's someone in my community I'm really angry at. And every time I pray, I keep getting distracted by thinking about him. And I said, maybe that's not a distraction. Maybe that's God raising it up. How do we know that? Well, I mean, think part of it is if it's something that you haven't prayed about and that seems to be important. Now, if it's something that you are always thinking about, like, oh, I hate my boss, or oh, it's probably distraction, So think about whether or not God is raising this up, or if it's just something that you've thought about constantly and you need to kind of set aside. Those are usually easy to figure out. Okay, the harder ones are they're easy to figure out and deal with because you can either let it go or you can think about it or pray about it. What about real distractions? Like you have a bad back, you have a sore throat, it's raining, you hear the noise from upstairs. It's a very New York thing, noise from outside, your truck beeping, you have a test coming up, you got, your kids are noisy, you got a big job thing tomorrow, what about those kinds of distractions? Well, spiritual writers talk about bubbles, birds, and balloons. I heard this once on a retreat. Bubbles, they come up, they go out, done. Birds, they come into your field of vision, they go out of your field of vision. Balloons, they come up, they go out, they pop. One of my favorite images is a recent one, though. I found it from Margaret Silf, the spiritual writer, and I put it in the book. And it's basically, I love this because it's really real, and I think it kind of fits with our experiences. If you're driving down the road, and I think most of us probably drive, or if you're walking down the road, there's all sorts of stuff going on beside you. There's lots of stuff, there's cars, maybe there's buildings and even people, and you kind of see it. You're aware of it, but you focus on the road. So it's not like you're like, oh, you don't do that. It's a little distracting. You see stuff, but you're focused. That's a great image of distractions in prayer. That's really helped me a lot. So you don't have to be like this Zen person who has no distractions. And I think we do a number on ourselves when we say, oh, I'm too distracted. Well, you're a human being. So now what do you do when you can't get rid of the distractions? You just can't. You have a bad back. I mean, physical pain is hard for a lot of people. You have, like some terrible medical thing coming up, or you have some funeral, or you're someone in your family is very sick, you just can't stop thinking about it. Well, that's where I like to pray my favorite prayer, which is, God, I'm distracted and I'm still with you. Because if we use the friend model, let's say Kate and I are out, and I say to Kate, I'm really sorry, but I'm really distracted. She would say, that's okay, I'm just glad you're here. Right? And as Ignatius would say, how much more can God do that with us? So can you let God be with you in your distractions? That can be very freeing for people because you get rid of the idea like I have to be this, even the Dalai Lama, I'm sure has, problems, and Pope Francis, and right? So no one is totally, by the way, there's a funny joke from, I'm sure the humorist Fran Lebowitz, right? She said, I heard her say this on that Netflix special. All it would take would be 10 minutes on the subway for the Dalai Lama to become a raging lunatic. So we all, everybody's human. So those are some ways of thinking about distraction. So we've talked about everyone can pray because we're all called. We all have this desire, which is God's desire for us. We talked about definitions of prayer, raising of the mind and heart to God, and then asking of good things, mutual conversation, a surge of the heart, long loving look at the real, personal relationship, which is Bill Barry, and then my own conscious conversation. We've looked at the kinds of things that can happen in prayer. And again, I didn't talk about the techniques because I think most of us, they're a little easier to learn. So the kinds of things that can happen in addition to dryness, which is very normal, are insights, emotions, memories, desires, words and phrases, feelings. And we talked a little bit about distractions. So I wanted to focus, knowing that you've had some background probably in a little bit of Ignatian spirituality, on I think one of the hardest topics, and one that's really kind of at the heart of the book that I wrote too, which I hope you like. So that's a little presentation for you. I'm much more happy to answer your questions because I much prefer those than listening to myself talk. So thanks very much.
Well, we really enjoy listening to you talk, so thank you. There is one question I have. I and there are more coming. The first is from someone anonymous, and they're asking if there's any suggestions for how to know when to keep persevering in prayer for something, and when God is saying no, and you should move on. They're praying to be blessed with children in this circumstance.
Well, anonymous attendee, and I understand why you would be anonymous. Jesus gives us actually an answer for that, which is the persistent widow who keeps asking in prayer. I think I talk a little bit about unanswered prayers in the book, and it's an invitation. I think, we don't know the answer to that. We don't know why God doesn't answer prayers, right? I mean, we have to be clear. If you pray for someone to get healed and they die, your prayer was not answered, at least in the way you would like it to be answered. Maybe you get another thing, you get grace, or you get peace, or you get, a sense of perspective. But we have to be clear that is not an answer to what you prayed for, right? And asking for children and not getting it feels like you're not getting it, the answer yet. I'd say I'd continue to persevere. I think if you're asking for something good, to persevere, but also be trusting that God hears you, and and in a sense accepting of what God's answer is, right? One of my favorite images, I put this in the book, is from Karl Rahner, and he said that Jesus's prayer is characterized by three things: honesty, right? He prays, remove this cup from me, right? Trust. He says at Lazarus's tomb, I know you hear me. And acceptance, thy will be done. I think we tend to short circuit that by doing two or one, but not the third one. Like, we're not honest. Some people are not honest. They're like, oh, whatever God wants, right? But God wants us to be honest. Sometimes people don't trust that God hears them, but I think most often it's the acceptance part, But so I find that really helpful: honesty, trust, and acceptance. It's very human, and you don't want to short circuit that. So I would just say, I don't know if I'd say move on. I'd say you can always pray for that, but also it's a question of kind of accepting God's answer right now. And it's also a holy thing to pray for. But thanks for asking it.
And maybe you see the second one in that queue, which is related, and maybe you kind of alluded to, is how do you know if your prayer has been answered?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I had this whole chapter on basically unanswered prayers, and maybe to dive a little deeper. Now, I guess I can say this person's name. Can I say this person's name? Philip. I don't mean to be, this is not a flip answer at all. I'm not meaning to be flip, but I guess sometimes we do know, like if you pray for a healing and you're healed, if you pray for a job and you get a job, sometimes it's easy. But I think your question is more, what happens when we don't feel like our prayer is answered, right? And I think we have to be honest about this. And I try to be honest in the book. If you pray for someone, like my dad died in 2001, he had lung cancer. I prayed for him to be healed. He didn't get healed and he died. So we can't say, it was answered in a different way. And I think that the responses are sometimes they help people, sometimes they don't. Here are the main responses. Well, God's testing you. Okay, well, the problem is, if you say that to someone whose child is sick with cancer, it makes God out to be like a monster, right? It's like God's testing you and we're testing the child, and it doesn't seem to make sense. Now, for some people, they do think some of the things that come to them are tests, and that's fine, Second, God is answering you, but the answer is no. Also hard if you think about like a sick child. For me, that's always, or Ukraine, right? God saying, no, I'm not going to bring peace to Ukraine. That's this very strange image of God. But again, sometimes that helps people. People say, all right, I accept that answer. So what I'm saying is I'm giving you the normal responses. I don't think we should impose them on people, but sometimes these help people. Or sometimes people say, God is answering the prayer, but not in a way that you can see. So you get patience or peace or perspective or calm. But that's also making out God to be like, it's like a mystery, like a murder mystery. You have to like solve the clue, like what am I getting? I think for me in my own life, and this is just me, I think that the most honest answer is we don't know. We don't know why some prayers are not answered. And I think the invitation is, can we believe in a God we don't understand? That's because it's about the relationship. So that's a hard question. But those are my answers. And I would say, in the times when it doesn't seem like your prayer is answered, the invitation is to still believe in a God who you don't understand, which is okay, because we can't understand God.
Trisha is, her question is, what are your suggestions for getting back to a prayer routine? Specifically, it's not currently part of my daily routine, and I often forget until the end of the day when I'm exhausted and fall asleep.
Well, Tricia, I think that it depends on what you like. For some people, reading a little like the gospel passage for the day, or reading "Give Us This Day" or Magnificat is a great way to start, right? For other people, it's just being quiet. So Tricia, what I'm saying is like different prayer techniques work for different people. But I would say one thing is the examination of conscience, which is a review of the day, just different ways of doing it. But you start with gratitude. You remember the things you're grateful for. You review the day. You apologize for the things you've done wrong. You ask for God's grace for the next day. Now I see your question about I'm exhausted and I fall asleep. That's very common for people. I'll tell you a funny story. A Jesuit came to me once and said, I'm doing my examen, but I always fall asleep. I said, well, which is very common, and I'm not making fun of you at all. It's a very common thing because we all do. I mean, I do it at 11 o'clock. And I said, well, he said, I'm always falling asleep. I said, wow, were you getting enough sleep? He goes, yeah, I get plenty of sleep. I said, well, why don't you describe your end of the day activities? And I often ask people to do this, like, what do you actually do? Let's talk about this. Well, I shut down my computer, give myself time to relax, and I brush my teeth, and I go into my pajamas. This is really funny. Then I get under the covers. Then I start my prayer. I was like, what? He said, what do you mean? I said, you get under the covers and then you pray with your head on the pillow. I said, I have an idea. Why don't you sit in a chair and do it? So for this person, it just meant doing it differently. Tricia, sometimes people do it in the morning. They do the examen from the day before, so you might try that. But I think the examen is the best way to jumpstart your prayer life. It's very short. It'll show you where God is in your daily life, and it's easy to kind of insert. So try the examen. Try it a different time of the day, though. Try it in the morning, or at lunchtime for the last 24 hours.
Very good. Oh, okay, I'm trying to get all these and I'm hopping around. Bob asked, how do we know when a consolation is truly a consolation and not my own ego getting in the way?
Well, it's those questions I was asking earlier about, is it from God? Okay, is it from the good spirit? Does it make sense with what you know about your life? Does it fit with what we know about God? Does it lead to an increase in love, faith, and charity? Is it a distraction? I would trust yourself. So let's take the example of, you're praying about the pandemic and you feel a sense of peace. Just trust that that's from God. That's probably not your ego. I think the ego gets in the way usually when we try to sort of put words in God's mouth, like, oh, should I leave this job? Yes. Rather than kind of letting it be revealed. But I think usually I think people in my experience can trust themselves to say that this is coming from God and this is not coming from God. And of course it's all going to be mediated anyway. So let's take a specific example. Let's say that you are praying about the Our Father and you have a memory of I don't know, just a church comes up. Hallowed be thy name, and you just think of this beautiful church you were in, have a beautiful memory. That's probably not your ego. Do you know what I'm saying? It's organic. It happens, and it seems to also a lot of times it seems to come from outside of you. It's something you wouldn't have come up with. But I would say generally trust yourself that you'll be able to discern that.
All right. On the chat, Michelle has asked, sometimes my patients ask me to pray with them. Do you follow a certain format when you're praying with someone?
Well, patients, as in medical patients?
But that's what I'm assuming.
Well, yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Patients ask. Oh, I would just say conversation. Just as Ignatius says, speak to God as one friend speaks to another. Speak conversational. God, I'm here with this person. They're really asking for your help. They're sick. They need healing. They need faith. Please help this person and let them know of your loving care. Just be open and spontaneous. And maybe ask the person to pray too. That can be very powerful for people. Would you like to say something to God? That can be very, especially in situations like that, very moving, because a person sometimes isn't invited to verbalize it. When they verbalize, it can be very moving for them. So that can be a release too. It's a really special. You're lucky that your patients ask you to do that. It's beautiful. They must feel very comfortable with you.
This is Anne Marie Decker. She's asking, is there a greater value in praying with others versus praying alone? What is the value of praying with others?
Praying alone. Oh, also, I see some questions in the Q&A part too.
Yep, I'm kind of going back and forth.
Okay, great. What's the value of praying with us? Yeah, well, look, we're social animals, right? We're social beings, and I think we're built for that, right? One of my favorite lines from the theologian Jane Redmond. Jane Redmond said, "There's a reason why all those stories about the Holy Spirit happen in groups." So I think it can help us see different ways that the Spirit is at work. I don't think it's in a sense it works better, because we don't know how those things work. It's not like God's not going to hear you if you pray by yourself. I mean, Jesus says, go in your room and close the door. He just said that on Ash Wednesday. So yeah, I think the value is just a sense of community, I would say. Yeah.
Andrea is asking, some people think that there are no coincidences in life and that everything has a purpose or a message. And what do you think about that? Do we interpret all coincidences as casual connections or signs of God?
One of my favorite comments is from a Jesuit who said, "Not every leaf that falls in front of you is a big sign from God." But some things are, right? And I think that's where discernment comes in. I think maybe in the larger scheme of things, providence is really, overarching everything. But I think if you try to see everything that happens to you as a sign, I think you can kind of drive yourself crazy. So, so Kate just nodded. Is that a sign to me that, it just means Kate's nodding, right? So, I mean, that you kind of get a little crazy. However, there are some things that happen that I think it would be really hard to say that's not God. Right? I mean, I've heard people tell me these stories like, well, and then this thing, and they tell me the story about, I'll tell you a story. Someone told me recently that they were looking for a sign of God's presence in their life. They were looking for a sign of God's presence. And I said, I will pray that you have that. 2 days later, they called me and they said, this friend of mine picked me up and said, let's go to this place I want to go to. It turns out it was the church I was baptized in. I sat down. I had this incredible sense of bliss, of joy, and awe. And I was like, you would have to work really hard to say that's not God. You see what I'm saying? Versus the leaf that comes in front of you. So I do think that there are many signs of God's presence and that it's, sort of the working of providence. But I think we have to be careful not to make every single thing that happens to us like a sign. I mean, it might be a sense of God's presence, right? But you see what I'm saying? It's not a huge message that requires kind of discernment. Otherwise, I don't think you'd be able to live your life. So that's discernment. Again, not every leaf that falls in front of you is a big sign from God, but it might be something gentle, like God is in nature. You see what I'm saying? So be careful not to use them, in a sense, almost like a magical way.
I like this one. This attendee has young children, 1 and 3, and any tips on starting them out with a healthy prayer life?
Oh, let's just say I didn't quite hear the beginning, but let me see.
This person has 2 young children, 1-year-old and 3-year-old, and they're wondering on any tips for starting them out with healthy prayer life.
Well, I always say I'm not the expert. I don't have kids, obviously, and so you might be the expert. But I think that parents can trust that their kids probably have an idea and an understanding of God that might be very direct, because I think kids aren't sort of burdened with all the shoulds, like I should do this, and just I think ask them to talk to God in their own language, in their own with their own words, right? And maybe encourage them. Say, is there anything you'd like to say to God tonight? Or where did you find God today? So I think encouraging them to be honest and conversational with God is probably the best thing. That's my experience. I was with my nephew once, who is now, oh boy, 16, and we were at the creche scene at his local parish, and I said, do you want to ask Jesus for something? Because I always think for kids, a lot of times it's talking to God, in addition to noticing God. And that's kind of helpful. Just you can say anything you want to God. And I thought he was going to say, I want a fire truck. I want this. I want that. He said, oh, make me a good boy, Jesus. It's nice. It was really sweet. He was like 7 or 8. So, I couldn't have improved on that.
Great. Okay. Are there certain things we pray for that God can't do? giving peace in Ukraine as an example. Marianne is wondering.
I assume God can do everything. The question is, why doesn't God do all these things? The peace in Ukraine, I have to say that's a mystery to me. 2 million refugees. Everyone's praying. So yeah, I mean, this is beyond us, right? This is this is the Holocaust, the mystery of suffering, child with cancer, natural disasters, and that really is beyond. The answer is there's no good answer for that question. And I think people who try to give you answers they're kind of fooling you. Because what are you going to say? He's testing the Ukraine, or so yeah, I'd say it's best to say we don't understand it, but we still believe in that God.
Okay, there's 3 more questions I think we could maybe have time for.
Sure.
Have you ever heard of people who hold their hands out in prayer and feel a sensation on their hands while praying?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I've heard of people who have felt warmth when they pray. One of the great things about being a Jesuit, I don't talk about this a lot, is I have kind of heard everything by now. And as a spiritual director for 20 years, and nothing, I've heard people, someone recently said they heard a voice, Jesus say, don't doubt me. Voice. This is the 3rd time in my life someone said that. And they were like, and I said, hey, God works in all sorts of ways. I've heard of physical experiences like that. I felt warm. I felt warmth in my chest. I've heard of people having mystical experiences, and these are regular people, where their view of the world changed. I know someone who talked about like seeing people as if they were children, imagining them as children. All sorts of experiences, and as well as the more common ones, insights, memories, emotions. So I have heard that, and I think part of it is to just say, hey, it's just one way that God has of communicating with me, and to not be afraid of it, but also not to be proud of it, like, oh, don't you have warm hands when you pray? I guess you're not holy like me, spiritual pride, or hope, or sort of hold yourself to that standard that now if I don't have that, it's not a good prayer. So it's to hold it lightly. But it's really been a gift to me. Like when I started as a Jesuit, I never thought I would say this, but I don't really. I mean, I think I don't think I've had anyone say to me they've seen a vision. But I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. Like I said, people hearing voices, and they're very rational people. One woman was a sister who has since died. Maybe you knew her, Sister Maddie Tiberi from Gloucester. Was at Gloucester for a long time, and she, when she was starting as a nun, she heard. I put this in one of my books. She heard the voice that said something like, "I've chosen you to be with me." Heard a voice. She's never heard that before. She's very rational. I had her write it down for me. And another man who said he heard a woman's voice say, "Your sins are forgiven" at Lourdes. So those are the 3 times. And here's the thing. You say to these people, hey, that's a great gift. Doesn't mean you're a saint or anything. It doesn't mean that you're going to have it again. It doesn't mean that you're holier than anybody else. It's just a nice gift, and you needed it, and that's beautiful. And I think truly, I'm a little face sharing now. It's really nice to be able to have heard so many things and be like, oh, okay. So yes, I have heard of the warmth in the hands and the heart too a lot. But for those of you who are listening, all 63 of you, do not think that because, I really want to say this, because you have not had those experiences, you have not heard, or you don't have warm hands, I never have either, that you're somehow not the elect, or that God doesn't love you, or that you're doing something wrong. It's just different. It's just different. It's okay. And that's the way that God has of speaking to these particular people. God meets you where you are.
Thank you. Philip, this is a biggie. It's a loaded question. Is prayer similar across all religions? Are there some religions with a uniquely different insight to prayer?
Oh, I think they differ. I mean, I think the monotheistic religions, you could say we're all praying to God, the one God. Obviously, Buddhism and Hinduism have a different understanding of the divine and of gods. And I don't understand Hinduism that well, but multiple gods. But I think for the monotheistic religions, we're praying to the same God. I think there's certainly different techniques and different practices, but I think we all want to be in an encounter with God. I do think that the Catholic and specifically the Jesuit tradition is quite unique, and that when it's introduced to people, they're like, "Oh, what?" The imaginative prayer. That I think is new for a lot of people, and even Protestants I meet, they're like, "Whoa," and they love it. I have a Protestant directee who never prayed that way. Now he loves it. It was all praise. It was all sort of the one, which is fine, but the kind of imaginative stuff was new. So yeah, they do, and I think we can learn from all these different religions too. But the heart for me is God. I mean, that's the kind of be in contact with God.
Okay, thank you. And then Amy Corby has her last question. She wants to know, what did feed my sheep mean specifically for your friend? How do you distinguish the meaning of an insight that could be interpreted in many ways?
I'm so glad I saw this question, Amy, and I'm glad Amy asked it and chose it. It's such a great question, because what it meant to him was that his call, he explained it, that his call was much broader than I'm going to teach philosophy at BC. Nothing wrong with that. Or I'm going to be chairman of the philosophy department at Loyola Chicago, right, or Santa Clara. It was much broader. It was like that God saying, well, that's what I want you to do. So in a sense, it matters less like where you are, and that's what I want. How do you distinguish the meaning of an insight that can be interpreted in many ways? Now, that's a great question, and that really is, I think that's almost like a lifetime of work, right? When my friend Sister Maddie heard, and I hate to focus on the hearing so much, but when she heard that, or when my friend heard that, that's kind of an unpacking. And look, in the Gospels, it's not always clear, what these things mean, and a lot of it that's kind of the life's work, right? But I think in general, he understood it as my mission is much broader than a particular school. It's just feeding my sheep wherever they find them, and whether it's at BC or Santa Clara or Spring Hill or St. Joe's. But that's a really great question. So I think a lot of it's unpacking it. I've had experiences in prayer which I've been like, I don't get it. In fact, I'll share something with you since people are being very honest. A couple of years ago, I had an experience in prayer on a retreat. Nothing like mystical, but I was thinking of Jesus at the rejection at Nazareth, right, where he's rejected in Nazareth, of course. And the crowd rejects him. And I remember thinking, how are you able to do this? Because you knew everybody in Nazareth. Nazareth was 200 to 400 people. And the words that I heard in prayer that came up were, must everyone like you? And I was like, well, actually, yes, because that's where I was at the time. But I was like, wow, it's an interesting thing. Well, a couple of years later, I wrote that book. Kate was talking about the book on LGBT people, and I had all these people hate me. Yeah. And I realized that probably was what that prayer was preparing me for. Yeah. And one of the things that enabled me to do this ministry with a modicum of sanity is the recognition that not everybody's going to like me. Not everyone's going to like me, love me, or approve of me. And that was from that retreat. So Amy, the question is like, I didn't quite understand it then. Like, okay, we should be free of the need to be approved of and loved and liked. And I was like, yeah, okay, that's a good insight, and I get that. But it wasn't until a couple of years later that I sort of think that that's what it meant. So it took a while, So I want to say also, if things come up in prayer that seem frightening, like if you have an image of the crucifixion, it doesn't mean some horrendous thing's going to happen. It can, so to kind of unpack these things, but pay attention and look, like experiences with our friends, we have to understand in the context of the friendship and love, and right. So yeah, so I think sometimes time helps us understand these things. That's a great question, though. Well, listen,
Jim, one of the things I love about wrapping it up that way is that you took what you learned from that prayer, and you see it as a preparation for what you would need later. And isn't that another really interesting way to look at prayer, that instead of asking for a problem you've got, it's helping you, in your life forward.
Yeah, that's a good point, Kate. And that's a really interesting point, that it was a kind of answer to a prayer that I hadn't really asked yet. Mm-hmm. I just say that I want to say also, I'm always very conscious of people maybe comparing themselves and thinking, oh, that hasn't happened to me. I haven't had a prayer that comes like true a couple of years from now. That's rare for me. Usually it's kind of like, oh, okay, I see what like I'm being asked to look at or an insight or so that was rare. That's kind of rare that it takes like 3 years. But when it started to happen, it dawned on me like, oh my gosh, I remember that. I remember that invitation. So yeah, but you're right. It is a nice way to look at a prayer being answered. Yeah.
Mhm.
Listen, before I wrap up, I want to say, first of all, thank you to Kate and Amy for hosting this. Thank you to all of you for joining me. And please keep me in your prayers. I would really appreciate that. And I'd also ask you, there's someone in my family who's been, two people who've been pretty sick. And so I'd ask for your
Mm.
prayers for them. That would be really nice. I'd appreciate that. So
Great.
thanks very much.
Oh, Jim, thank you. And I think what's so wonderful is we've been reassured, challenged, guided, set free. I mean, kind of all of it. So, and as you can see from the chat, where you're receiving a lot of gratitude and wonderful comments. So, we thank you for kicking us off our Lenten series in such a beautiful and helpful way. And also, you want to give Carrie Weber a pitch?
You want me to can I give Carrie Weber a pitch? Yeah,
Yeah.
she's great. So Carrie Weber is talking about almsgiving, right?
Mhm.
Carrie Weber is a wonderful, I would say young woman. To me, she's young. She's a wonderful writer, and she wrote a wonderful book called Mercy in the City, which was living out the Beatitudes in sort of city life. So she's very much about like living a practical spirituality. She's married, she has 3 kids. She works a full-time job, so it's very practical. She's funny, she's accessible, she's great, and
Great.
all the people that go to see her love her. So you'll love her. She's very accessible and inviting and practical.
And thank you for the steer. And we also, don't forget, we also have Eric and Brenna talking about fasting. So, so thanks so much again, Jim. And thanks to everyone who joined us. If you have another idea for a webinar, Amy and I are happy to hear from you. And for now, a wonderful Lent to everybody. And Jim, thank you again.
You're welcome. Thanks. God bless you all.
Wonderful
Thanks.
to see you.
Good, Father Martin. Thank you,
Good to see you
everyone.
guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.